Good afternoon and welcome to the latest edition of Office Hours. I am Joe Perfetti, the host. Today I would like to welcome our very special guest, Dr. Larry Starr of Jefferson and Dr. Scott Koerwer of Geisinger. Basically today we're going to focus on interacting with complexity, leadership during a global pandemic. And I brought two terrific systems thinkers and academic scholars that can help us apply this in a very practical sense to the conversation. So welcome to our show. For those of you that are watching on YouTube Live, if you have any questions as we go along, feel free to enter them in the text box. We're happy to answer them. But the general purpose of the show, again, is that in today's online world, it's usually a one-way conversation. And Office Hours presents an opportunity for you to ask us questions and interact with the faculty and to hear us discuss in a very practical way important concepts. Again, today's being focused on complexity. So gentlemen, welcome. So just for our benefit of our audience, Larry, if you want to start with a quick introduction.
Sure. My name is Larry Starr, and I'm the director of two doctoral programs at Thomas Jefferson University, one in complex systems leadership and the other in strategic leadership. And these programs have been operating for 5 years. Prior to that, I was at the University of Pennsylvania for 12 years. And I've also been in corporate education and corporate compliance for about 15 years. So that's a little bit of my background.
No, great, extensive and very impressive. Scott?
Great. Good afternoon. Happy to be back on Office Hours. Scott Koerwer. I serve as the Vice President for Strategy and Planning at Geisinger Commonwealth School of Medicine. I'm also the founding dean of the graduate school there and on the faculty, and have been working in education and a student of leadership for about 30 years. And I'm so glad that we're talking a bit about this, because I'd like to say that it's getting easier and we have a better sense of what leadership is and what it means. But, in complex times like these, it's increasingly elusive. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Yeah, and again, I'm Joe Perfetti. I'm the host. I am a faculty member at the University of Maryland, College Park. Also do a lot of executive education and consulting at organizations like Duke. I've actually done some work with Jefferson, and here to kind of share kind of that perspective as well as the academic perspective. So,
dynamite
conversation. Scott, why don't you kick us off?
Yeah, so I'm always interested in trying to level set a little bit. How many times you walk into a room and you throw around words like strategy or mission or vision or purpose, and you don't define them. So I'm interested in your individual definitions of leadership. And Larry, you've written about this. I know you've consulted about this for leaders around the globe. Would you kick us off? How do you define leadership? And I think we've got a blurb of yours that we might bring up as you introduce your definition.
Well, okay, so that's an enormously loaded question. I suppose the history of leadership goes back to the first opportunities of kings and generals. And over these past millennia, there's really not been any agreed upon definition. And in fact, the idea that because there are so many different ways people think about this, so much is written about it. I think I did a Google search and came up with something like 200 or 300 million scholarly hits on the topic of leadership. So the short answer is I look at it in two ways simultaneously. One is by sort of the prevailing approach. And that's not necessarily what you see in this table. But the prevailing approach is that leadership is a process, some kind of activity between one person and a group. And the activity is about influencing other people to meet some agreed upon set of goals or outcomes. So leadership generally in an organization is about setting an agenda and coming up with ideas and then enabling other people to follow or meet those ideas. Mm-hmm. That's prevailing. But we live in strange times. The word complexity is thrown around. The idea that no one has ever seen anything like this before. Why is it that leadership, the way we normally have done it, doesn't seem to be working? The models of the past are not as effective or applicable. And so there is a kind of a systems complexity view of leadership, and it's a little different. In this view, and I hold this as well, leadership is something that emerges. It's not necessarily in an individual who does something. It emerges from the interaction of a whole set of activities and instances and procedures and influences. And so leadership is alive. It can be in one kind of person. It actually can be in an idea. And so you can have a leading idea that everybody follows without necessarily focusing specifically on the person. So in a dynamic environment, leadership is emergent. Now, if you're focusing on what the leader does, then it's that interaction between that and strategy itself. And that's more where the definition that you put up makes a little more sense.
Yeah.
So that's my take on it. It's both. It's both what the person does and how people respond and the processes, but it's also something that emerges, comes up due to the interaction in complex environments. And we're watching Dr. Fauci in political terms emerging, and we're looking at other people who seem to be de-emerging, if that's a proper word. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, I think it does. Joe, what about you? It doesn't seem that it's as simple as if you're a Star Trek fan, Jean-Luc Picard having named number one. It's not that simple.
Well, I think there's the traditional definition of leadership versus management. But I want to pick up on what I agree with Larry's definition, because the word resonated with me is leaders are enablers. And I think that's actually one of the keys to a key part of leadership. The other one is they provide context in addition to direction. And I think that's important because, there's some books that talk about, you don't have a leader if you don't have followers. And so the point is, it's not about command and control. It's about basically enabling the direction and getting people to want to do that. So there's some persuasion that is an element of, I think, good leadership as well. And then the other thing that I think is really important from a leadership perspective is that leaders are adaptive, that they basically can take in information and recognize, and what I think kind of what Larry's poking at, you don't have to be the smartest person in the room. Meaning, I think there was kind of a traditional, whoever's strongest becomes the leader. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, because leaders kind of take and assemble the talents of the team. And if they can make the team better, then that actually, I think, is what leads to an emergent leader.
Mm-hmm. Larry, you have a way of weaving strategy, systems thinking, philosophies of leadership together in a manner that is almost a sense-making device. You both use the word context. What are you thinking about leadership and the COVID context that we find ourselves in today?
Right. So let me take a step back, because there's a history of thinking that I'm sensitive to. And I look at leadership through frameworks, which is similar to the idea of a mindset. You don't go right to the leadership. You first look at the broader picture, and you ask, what do you see at the broadest level? Then how does leadership apply or operate or come out in that particular context? And back to what Joe was suggesting as well, I look at sort of four organizing ways of thinking about leadership. One is the idea of indirect influence or great ideas, where somebody comes up with this terrific concept or great strategy, and if there is persuasion or there isn't, people are attracted to that great idea, and leadership occurs. Leading ideas leadership is very important, particularly when people are confused or there's ambiguity or a lack of clarity. The idea that this looks like a way to follow something that will meet my ends as well as what the leader is doing. Now, the second is much more traditional, the idea that the leader has particular skills or behaviors or styles, or is authentic or is transformational. That's really important. That's in the person. The third, and Joe also was
like a
suggesting
trait-based
this.
activity.
Yes, exactly right. A trait, a behavior. Right. The third is the sense of relational leadership. It's how you interact with other people, how you engage them, how you enable them to find meaning, how you yourself produce meaning in your actions, and that's the engagement, the collaboration part. Now, the question you're asking is about context. Context, in my sort of understanding, trumps all the others, because these other ways of thinking about leadership don't really think much about context.
Right.
Does a leading idea or do certain traits or skills or relationships, that they apply as usual in the middle of a global pandemic or in a war or in some other amazingly immersive context? And I think the answer is sort of yes, but. And the but is that it takes more. My sense is it's necessary but insufficient. And so leadership in a complex and chaotic environment needs those other things, but then it needs other things in addition. Different ways of thinking, different methodologies, different tools, an approach that maybe you hadn't thought about before. And that's, I think, the special situation that we're in at the present time and are likely to remain in for a good long time. Yeah. So I think it's everything and there's more, and we haven't yet talked about the more.
Right.
So, Scott, I want to give two practical examples that I think feed into what Larry was talking about.
Yeah.
So I remember at Wharton, there's a guy named Mike Yassine. And one of the things that he liked to talk about in his book was the story of smoke jumpers. And basically, the short version of the story is
man golf, right? Yeah.
Basically, in smoke jumping, well, everybody's running away from the fire. The smoke jumpers go to the fire, parachute in to try and control it. And the basic story was that a relatively new team with an inexperienced leader went in to control the fire. And the fire got out of control, and the leader was asking them to do something that didn't sound right, even though it was the right thing to do, and nobody followed, and a lot of people died. And I think that's the key, which is we call him the leader, but he wasn't really the leader. He just happened to be the manager assigned to the team, and he didn't establish some of those leadership principles that Larry was talking about. And I want to compare and contrast this. We talk about the virus, the governors that have been most successful, think about what Cuomo did for 100 days, which is he said, look, I can't make 16 million people wear masks. I can't make 16 million people, stay home by fiat. There's only so much I can do with penalizing. If I can't educate you, if I can't convince you, if I can't kind of use moral suasion. And so that was the point, is that he was very practical, he was very transparent. And I think that is what inspired people to want to follow him rather than command and control.
Yeah. There's almost this hope of leadership that will have leaders will emerge, and they'll make things simpler. They'll make it practical. They'll help us understand. In many ways, Cuomo did that, but there's a lot of risk in that because what happens when, as with COVID, something changes and the governor of the state comes out and says, yesterday we said gatherings of 50 were okay. Today we're saying now you have to reduce the gathering down to 25. We're trying to think about how we open up our public school systems, our K through 12 infrastructure in America. how does a leader manage this complexity that changes moment by moment without losing credibility? It's a great question, but do our leaders have credibility right now?
Right. Well, so great question. Depends who you ask.
Right.
There are tens of millions who think that one person has credibility, and another group of tens of millions think that that person has no credibility at all.
Yeah.
I think the question you're asking is, how does a leader address a particular problem when that problem seems to be incredibly complex?
Yeah.
And the answer is, there is a way of thinking and presenting and conceiving and putting together the framework for what am I supposed to do when I am the leader in this particular situation. And the literature argues, and practice tends to support, that in the kind of crisis that we are in now, there are no real experts in the whole picture. Yeah. Nobody's ever been through this before. Nobody's ever seen anything like this before. It is, as you've suggested, a crisis of health, economics. It is a social crisis. It is an education crisis. It's more. It's all kinds of things, all interconnected and alive. And so when the governor gets in front of his community, he is not an expert.
Right.
All he can do is draw the best that he can from the people who he deals with. And he can offer a sense of, we can anticipate this, we know we can do this, but we need all of us to work together to really do that. And I think that was one of the great strengths of the New York governor, is he was saying, listen, we're in this together. We need to work together. And so these are the guidelines I'm suggesting that we all follow. And I want to say we must do it, but even if I do, it takes all of you to adhere. And so it's an engagement process as well as anything else. And I think that's relevant to this kind of crisis.
Yeah. Yeah. Joe, I know you're a big data guy, and I appreciate that you don't look exclusively at financial data when you advise leaders in the companies that you consult to. What are the data points that you see leaders looking to now when they're trying to make decisions what to do with their businesses with COVID? And as Larry said, we've got a health crisis, we've got an environmental crisis, we've got a safety crisis, we've got a food crisis, we've got a political crisis in America, at least. What data points do you see leaders looking at?
Well, I want to answer your question two ways, because the first part is we have to actually agree on what data is. And that's what seems to be intentionally being confused and obfuscated in the world today. That facts are facts. And basically, we have to agree on what, to some degree, facts are. And then from there, we have to figure out what's relevant. But I think what's more important than the actual data point, because obviously it would vary based on the decision you make, is to be, number one, authentic, and number two, transparent. Meaning, if I'm a leader and I'm making decisions under uncertainty, I need to explain to you that I'm doing something that's uncertain. And number two, I have to explain to you my thought process. So I'm going to give you my methodology, and I'm going to show you the data that I'm using with the methodology to make that decision, right? So essentially, I have to convince you that that is a reasonable process. And that is what's more likely to want you to come to follow along. Because the flip side is, if I just give you data and I don't give it to you without saying it comes from a black box, you're not going to trust it. And the same thing, if I give you a process, but I don't tell you what data went into the process, then it's a black box. You're not going to trust it. So I have to put both together, and I have to be very authentic about that. And then that's the next thing. I have to tell you that, look, there's a probability here. This is not 100%. And if I'm wrong, I'm going to adapt. And I need to set that expectation up in front. right? So as a matter of fact, in finance, we have a thing where we talk about risk and uncertainty in budgets because people hate surprises in budgets. And what I basically tell them is, if you told me you're going to make money and you didn't make it, then I'm going to be really pissed off. But if you told me that you weren't sure that you're going to make it, and I knew it in advance, I still might be unhappy. But at least you set my expectation that it may not work. And that sounds subtle, but I think that's important in any decision-making process.
Yeah, that variance. So this is not meant to be a trick question, but I hope each of us will identify in our mind a leader that we observe doing good things now. And I'm purposely being vague, good things, so that we can draw some of those in. But before we respond who leaders are, Larry, we've got this learning picture in a slide deck that I'm hoping Joe can bring up. It might be slide 4 or 5 in our deck. But you spend a lot of time, Larry, helping individuals speak, not that one, keep going through, please. Think about how, there we go, how you become a leader or how you learn so that you can lead, how you can adapt. Would you share some of your thoughts about that?
Sure. So one of the things we are alluding to, but we haven't really addressed head on, is that leaders have certain capacities or proficiencies or competencies to think in particular ways for particular kinds of problems in particular kinds of contexts. And the traditional way of thinking by a leader is to be analytic. To be able to examine the very complicated kinds of problems and to reduce them to root causes and then figure out exactly what to do. This is very important for certain kinds of problems. But the kinds of problems we're dealing with now are increasingly complex. And the more appropriate additional proficiency is to think in systems. Which is different than thinking analytically. Systems thinking is a way of thinking, and it has a series of capacities, and there are methodologies that follow from systems thinking and tools that follow from that. The slide you put up is a system view of learning, And because there's a lot of conversation going on in our community and probably across the United States and other countries about what are we going to do in the fall about bringing the people back to school. And most of the focus is on, the students need to return to the classroom. But the teachers are concerned. And what about the parents? This is a view of learning as a system of learning. And it argues that there are 4 interdependent elements. One is certainly the learner. One is the teacher. Another is the content. And the 4th is the context. And this particular slide refers to the model of learning that we use in doctoral programs, at least the ones that we have at Jefferson. And it argues that if you're going to look at learning as a system, then learning is not a product, an outcome, something that happens if you go to a class. Learning emerges from the interaction of characteristics of the individual. What does that person need? What kind of learning works best for that person? How aggressive are they in terms of their need for information? The approach of the instructor. Does the instructor hold all the knowledge, or is the instructor facilitating knowledge, using a network, finding other people to bring into the classroom, using information that the instructor has to facilitate the changes needed in the student to accept or to search for more knowledge? The content itself is relevant. Where is that knowledge? Where is that content? Is it even possible that a leader today has access to everything that could be done to solve the problems that leader is trying to do? I mean, that seems impossible. No one has that kind of knowledge. And then finally, the context. If we're dealing in an environment that's as you suggest, volatile, uncertain, ambiguous. Everybody is online and nobody wants to be online. Things are just upside down, and we really don't know what's going to happen. How does the relationship between student, content, and teacher change in this new environment? How will learning actually occur in the environment in which we are now operating? And what are we supposed to do about it? That's a system view.
Yeah.
And when you look at it in this kind of, multi-dimensional, interactive way, you say, "My gosh, do we just bring the kids back? Bring the students back? How do we think about this?" And the context is not just the context of learning; it's the context of being a member of a community. So there are teachers, students, staff members. There's the city in which you live. There's your parents. There's your family. There are other universities. There are all the things that human beings need to address in learning, just because they happen to be going to a school. And whether they're at home or not, all of those relationships still exist.
Yeah.
And so that's all part of learning as well. So it becomes quite a difficult, kind of problem to formulate, let alone come up with an answer to.
Yep. So Joe, I'm gonna. I appreciate that response, and that you're tying it into the higher education question now, the K through 12 education. How do we bring people back? And you both know I've been working on an essay that I've titled loosely, are we opening up college campuses, or are we opening up communities? So jumping off the cliff first. The leader that I admire right now is the president of Cornell University, Martha Pollack, computer scientist, has studied Agile and, has designed programs. But as the leader of Cornell University, what she did was pull together teams of faculty and administrators to create scenarios. What will happen if we don't bring anyone back and we do everything online? What will happen if we do bring everyone back? How will it look? Back to Joe's point, what's the variance in the results that we might have? What are the risks of bringing people back? What are the uncertainties of bringing them back? What are the risks of not bringing people back? The result was a comprehensive, complex presentation that was perfectly delivered and relevant the day it was delivered. What I like the most about this, though, is that it was acknowledged when it was delivered, and everything will likely change now that we've published our document. In my mind, that's leadership. Leverage the resources around you, a great place like Cornell University, have multiple scenarios created, present it, and say, this is what we think right now. So, Joe, what leadership are you observing?
Well, I want to answer two things. I want to come back to yours because I have a perspective on that I think is important.
But please do name one. You have to pick one.
But the person I want to pick first is Mayor Dugan of Detroit. I was in a presentation he made last summer where he was trying to woo a business to move to the city of Detroit. And I have to say, I was amazed. Now, first of all, just understand that he had a 70-something% approval rating as a white mayor in a mostly African-American city, which is not easy to do. And he basically, and what was impressive was when he got out of college as a lawyer, all his friends went and made tons of money working for big law firms. And he said, no, I'm going back to Detroit, my hometown, and it needs help. And I'm going to go roll up my sleeves and do what I can. And when he became mayor, he went to the community, listened to what they actually said they needed, and that's where he started. And even in the workforce, what he said to companies, his message was, look, we will train the workers for you to enable you to come here to the city. I mean, it was just a completely different, refreshing perspective. And it energized everything around him. And everything he did was about removing barriers. And that was the language that was used by every city department that we met with. And they were all encouraged to be innovative, to fast fail. And you just wouldn't expect that in government. And so my hat's off to the city of Detroit for embracing that.
Joe, I've heard you talk about him before. Now, didn't you tell me he also had a health background? Wasn't he a president of a health system or something?
Yeah, he also was working with the local health system. But his perspective was always to understand the community's needs and to be responsive to the community, whatever it was. And he didn't even think about politics. It didn't matter. It was just doing what was the right thing. And I thought that was just, again, very encouraging. Yeah. But back to your point, Scott, one of the other things, I know we were going to mention the idea of Kinefin framework, is that I look at the problems that leaders have to solve into two types. I simplified what Dave Snowden did in Kinefin. And I'll just give the point here because I think it relates to your example. But the way I always simplified it is your problems are either complicated or complex. And the idea of complicated says it's like chess, like it's solvable. If you spend enough time, you can actually outthink your opponent and you can come up with the elegant solution. But I play poker, and complex problems basically say you can hem and haw all you want, but you got to make a bet before you see that next card. And there's no amount of things you can do that prevents you from having to see that next card, and you have to act before you see it. That's, I think, an important element of what you're talking about, Scott, in leadership, is that what Cornell is doing is they're addressing a complex environment where they have to make a bet before they know what the answer is. And I think successful leaders understand that. And they're actually, again, number one, thinking in terms of scenarios, which I think is the right thing. They're explaining their methodology, and they're relying on the data, which is everything we're talking about. So it's no surprise that you would use Cornell as an example and an exemplar of what to do in leadership, particularly in a complex environment.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you spent a lot of time thinking about the math, Joe, between the difference of chess and poker. And Larry, I know you spent an awful lot of time thinking about Snowden's Kinefin framework. I'm impressed, and Larry, I hope you'll comment on this. I'm impressed with the time, and Joe, if you would bring that up for us, the time that Snowden takes to talk about the obvious and the chaotic, and that shelf between the two, that cliff, where sometimes leaders try to take a chaotic situation and act in unilateral manners, but confuse chaos by trying to make it simple or obvious. Larry, what risk do we run as leaders now trying to make something simple when it's really in a state of chaos? Do you have any comment on that?
Let me say this. Some years ago, I was listening to the head of strategy of General Motors give a talk, and he had been educated by my mentor, who was also at Wharton, Russell Akoff. And he said, when we hit sort of the edge of chaos, we shift from ready, aim, fire to ready, fire, aim. And what he meant by that was that when you're perceiving that the situation is chaotic or about to become chaotic, as Joe says, you have to make a bet now. You have to act now. And it's not that you're trying to make it simple. It's that you cannot tolerate and survive in a chaotic environment. So you have to make your best choice. Got to do it now. And then after you've made that choice, you quickly maneuver, pivot as much as you can, and see if you can begin to hit your targets. The whole idea of Snowden's model is that the situation you're in can be in one of these different states, but you don't want to be in the wrong state. You want to move as much as you can from where you are to something that's controllable. So there is a push to move things from complex to complicated to obvious or simple, or chaotic back to simple. I mean, there's only so much latitude you have as a leader when you're confronted with high complexity and chaos. You've got to figure out as quickly as possible what it is you have to do. Now, the process of doing that is the challenge. And so back to some of the things that we've talked about before. Well, one of the definitions of complexity that I've always liked comes from cognitive psychology. And it's as follows. Complexity occurs when the prototype in your head is not applicable to anything that you're actually seeing. You're watching what's happening, you're caught up in the situation, you're getting all the data, and you're searching around for some kind of something or other that will make sense of this, that will fit and tell you what to do. But there isn't anything there. You just have never seen anything like this before. That is the complexity that many people are suffering with. And so if you don't have anything, what are you supposed to do? Well, that's where you start reaching out for other people and saying...
Is this a cognitive dissonance like state, or is it something else you're describing?
The dissonance is your response to it.
Yeah.
Okay. The reality is you're forced to make choices now. I mean, people are dying. Equipment is being lost. Students have to go to school. Funding is at stake. Companies are on the threat, or in fact are going under. People themselves are caught up against walls that they're hitting that they just don't know what else to do. This is not about a problem. This is the problem. And you've got to act, and act in the very best possible way. And so sort of thinking about this as a whole system is a pathway in. But what you actually do is to try and maneuver it to a place where you can get some sense of control. And I think that's why some of these school systems are saying, we're going in. Okay, we're opening, or we're not going in, we're closing. And it doesn't matter what the rationale is, they have to make a choice. You can't be living in continuous uncertainty. And making that choice, then ready, fire, aim, they now have to figure out how they're going to maneuver in the space that they've chosen.
Yeah.
I really like that definition. And so the whole point is, and I'll just throw this framework back up, in either side, on the left-hand side of the framework, you have to act. And I think in the military, they tell people at West Point, if you're in the middle of the battle, it's chaotic, go attack something. Doesn't matter what you attack, just go attack. Get on the offense. Got to play offense, can't play defense. Because I think the other part, and this is the system element, is there's a feedback loop there. Is that, see, I think what makes it successful, and this is the same idea in poker, is that the more you act, the more information you get. And if you can outlearn your opponent, then you will be more successful. And I think that's key in the real world, is that the action actually gives you more information so that your next decision is more informed. Where the person that's sitting there fumbling, trying to figure out what the hell to do, is never going to get that information, and they're never going to actually get the information, actually make the better decision. So it's not just act, it's the feedback from acting that actually makes the action more tenable.
Yeah, and I'll add one little piece to that. I think that there's a process of learning, getting basic data, figuring out what that actually information is, and then moving to knowing what it is that you're doing. But I think one of the end states is the feedback that leads to the understanding. The sort of, aha, we acted this way, I got the feedback, I think I understand what's actually happening now. And that enables me to make a better choice going forward. If you don't know, what's happening, if you don't understand it, if you don't get proper feedback, then you continually move forward with information, but you don't understand it. And I think there's sort of a crisis of understanding in the COVID environment.
Yeah.
I mean, what is happening in the South? Are people just not aware that if you wear a mask, it's helpful? I mean, how can you not understand that? And so the arguments by the heads of state, by people that they interview, no, it's okay if I don't do it, or I have this alternative approach and that will be successful, just is a lack of understanding. I said to Joe before we were starting that the pandemic of 1918, there was so little understanding of viruses that one of the arguments to prevent yourself from being infected was to eat porridge. And it was sort of like, it's the same kind of answer.
Yeah.
Why would you do that? Well, because it'll make you healthy. Everybody knows a breakfast of porridge is a good thing to do. Yeah, but that has nothing to do with understanding this particular situation, this context.
Yeah, yeah.
Well,
Joe, you go ahead. Pardon me. I want to come back to something weak signals, Joe, because I know you
yeah,
spent
but
time on that.
before I do, so I don't have the academic reference, but I can tell you that I was reading this in a book by Annie Duke called Thinking in Bets. That I want to pick up on what Larry said.
It's a great
And I think part of the answer that she referenced, and this comes from psychology, which is basically when people make a decision and they have a strong belief in their decision, even when they know they're wrong, they're not willing to accept that they're wrong. And that becomes part of the problem. And she said that the psychology goes back to just the way our genetics code works, because the idea was, if I told you back in caveman days that there's a tiger over there behind that bush, then basically there's two things you could do. You could either believe me, I could be wrong, or you could not believe me, and then there's a tiger there, and then you're going to die. So there's a bias that we've developed that basically says you're going to choose option B, which is to trust the information that you get, even if it's wrong. And we tend to be trusting of verbal information. But the problem then becomes when we then realize we're wrong, we're not willing to change that belief. And that, I think, is psychologically what's happening in the South.
Yeah, I agree with you. It's one of the many cognitive biases. And by the way, this helped win the Nobel Prize in 2002 for Kahneman and Tversky, this sense. And I agree with you. And I think that's leading so many people astray because they've made a choice and now they're sticking with it no matter what happens.
Yeah, right. To the death of us all.
Right. Joe, you and I work with a number of business anthropologists. And Snowden talks about this a little bit in his framework, but our colleagues in business anthropology talk about this an awful lot. What are the weak signals? What are the micro stories that develop that tip the behavior of other people seen in their leaders? So just to pick at a politician for a moment, there's a head of state who has refused to wear a mask up until just this week. So, our business anthropology colleagues would have helped us identify that this is a weak signal. It's a micro story, but it's a micro story of behavior of a leader that has shaped the behavior of millions. So back to weak signals. So Joe, are there any weak signals that you're observing in any of the businesses that you're working about? Things that leaders are picking up on or behaviors that leaders are exhibiting?
Well, and I guess that's the point, which is the first part of all of this is you have to be looking for them. Like if you're not even looking for the weak signal, then you're going to just get smacked in the face.
Yeah. So you're scanning. You're always scanning.
You have to be scanning. I mean, we talk about in an article that we wrote that, back in the day, Reed Hastings, the founder of Netflix, went to Blockbuster, offered to sell the business to them for $50 million. And Blockbuster said, nah, you're never going to make anything of yourself. And just they couldn't see what was right in front of them in terms of their own gloom and doom. So you have to almost be willing to look for the signals. But then here's the point. Like we're trying to figure that out right now in the COVID-based world, is that retail as we know it has shifted. And the retailers themselves are trying to figure out what are the buying patterns going to be in the future? Are we going to return to the traditional people going to the stores? Think about movies. Right now in movies, movie distribution, I mean, the theater across from where I live is literally boarded up. No one's going to that. And now you're actually seeing movies like last Friday, Greyhound, which was a Tom Hanks movie, was supposed to be launched in theaters this summer. Now it's being launched direct on distribution. Well, is that a weak signal telling us that the traditional model of seeing movies is now really reached the tipping point and they're going to be essentially eviscerated regardless of what happens with the virus when we go? So things like we have to start to look at that information and start to make some choices now and be aware of the probabilities that these can happen now. And so the first element is I got to at least start scanning, because if I'm not even paying attention to what's going on, I got my head down, I'm just going to be an ostrich.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. What are you observing there, Larry? I know you're always scanning the environment and thinking about the signals. What observations do you have?
Right. I completely agree with Joe. Rand Corporation wrote a great paper after 9/11 saying, why was it that the U.S. could not connect the dots? Because there's all this stuff about why didn't you see what was going on? And the paper said, well, it's not merely about connecting the dots. It's first identifying and collecting the appropriate dots, and then you can connect them. And that was the process of scanning. How do you pay attention and look around and see what's going on? Because if you're going to recognize patterns in order to make choices about what's going to happen in the future, you first have to be able to discern what are the threats and opportunities, what things are occurring, what events are relevant to what's happening. And alas, so much of the time we're the frog in the boiling water, caught up in this complexity. We can't really step back and look at what is occurring, or we're so parochial in our thinking. It's all about the U.S. And all we see are things going on elsewhere as threats, or why didn't they, or blame, or something along this line. I agree that for business to be successful and sustainable, there really has to be a fundamental shift in how people are thinking about their business models. And it begins first by scanning as much as possible and seeing what are the opportunities for entrepreneurship, what are the opportunities for new designs, what are the opportunities for new models of thinking about how we're doing things. Going back to school is a classic example. We ought to really rethink the whole situation. There should be, a completely different skunk works going on about how we think about education that we can try out during this opportunity right now, rather than just we go back and we don't go back, and then while we're there, we just use Zoom. None of that makes any sense to me, but again, you get caught up in the moment. So how do you scan? What are the processes you use? Where are you looking? What support and resources do you need to do that? That, I think, is a terrific opportunity and challenge.
Yeah, I agree with you. Back to my Star Trek metaphor earlier. I'm reminded of the Vulcan characters in Star Trek, and how learning takes place for them in digital pods. And these digital pods, if you have seen a young Spock character, the digital pod is an investment. We invest in higher education infrastructure, which is now empty. We have so overinvested in this infrastructure that we don't know what to do with our buildings. Our dormitories no longer suffice for the condition that we have with COVID, because we can't pair students up in a room sleeping less than 6 feet apart, charging students $10,000 for the year per person to sleep in this box. So I think about what will be that investment. And Joe, you mentioned the great Netflix example. This is happening in healthcare. The best leaders in healthcare right now, like Jaewon Ryu at Geisinger, know that we now want immediate satisfaction. We want healthcare now. And Joe, I know you've got a lot of data, and I've talked with hospital executives about that transition to telehealth and how rapidly it happened during COVID.
Yeah. So, and I know we're running out of time here, but I want to answer your question.
Please.
With a framework. Because what Larry said, we've been working on developing a framework, and it's nascent, but it's a variation, Scott, you and I have been talking about it, of the what's traditionally called the OODA Loop from the military. And essentially what we're saying here is that there's two parts of this framework. Call it SUD. It's a terrible acronym, but it's scan and understand, and then discern and decide. And the whole point is those are two separate muscles that leaders and organizations have to flex. Because whether it's your CEO, Geisinger, or any other medical professional, or whether it's higher education or medicine, if you can't scan, if you're not looking in the marketplace and you can't understand what those signals are telling you, then you'll never be able to create options. You'll never be able to discern what to do, and you're never going to be able to act. And to be honest with you, there's some organizations that are actually good at trying to get the data. They're terrible at action. And there's some organizations that are very good at acting, but have no idea what's coming ahead of them. And that was the Blockbuster example. And so it's a system and with feedback loops that work through the process. But I think that's the process that we have to work through. So the answer to your medical question or the education question is, what is the market telling you? What is the understanding of what that? Can you just make sense of that, the sense-making aspect? Then can you create a range of options? And then can you choose an appropriate option with a high probability? And then you get some feedback loops as you're making decisions because it's not discrete. Like, I think that's got to be the way you have to navigate your way through complexity. And by the way, my metaphor is the inchworm. You're inchworming your way along the path. That's how you make sense of complexity. You don't just go charging off.
And in this era that requires speed and decision-making and companies to seemingly make choices on the dime, it all brings us back to the inchworm.
Well,
Larry, I think we got to weave that in.
Maybe the inchworm. But
I like it.
a little thing, and then you kind of come back. But anyway, little levity here at the end. But actually, if we're going to end, I'd end with the Jack Welch quote, which basically says, if you're not keeping up with the market system, you're screwed, because it is going to change.
Yes.
That's the other thing. The inevitability is things are going to change, whether you want them to or not. And if you don't pay attention, you're screwed. And by the way, I always find it ironic that Jack Welch basically forecasts his own company's demise.
I do too. Larry, we do have just a few more minutes, but we didn't give you the chance to identify a leader, a weak signal that's being picked up on, a leader who's doing well, a leader who's not doing as well as we would like. Anyone come to your mind?
There's a political answer here. So my political answer is I wouldn't pick a single person. I would pick the leadership behaviors that have been emerging out of Thomas Jefferson University. And so at the very top is the CEO, who is the sort of the thought leader, the person who's going out, who's considering and arranging all of the activities around. And then there's the operational leader. And that person is actually bringing together an entire team of heterogeneous people and what's called the requisite mindset. And together with the leadership team and the broad base, they're generating ideas that lead to the strategy, that lead to the tactics and performance that they're doing. So I would say that the approach to leadership is the more important than the leader as an individual. And so I'm going to take my hat off to Jefferson for thinking about this in this very broad way.
Yes. I think that's a good one too. And Larry, in one of our other conversations, you reminded me, it's not as if institutions of higher education like Jefferson have just been dealing with COVID. They've been also having to interact with the challenges of social injustice and student unrest and the demand that we now finally begin to take on some of the inequities that we see in our communities. And Jefferson has been a leader in social determinants of health, and David Nash, the founder of the first school of population or college of population health in America. A lot of good work is being done there. So I like it.
Right. There's a great quote I came across, which is when the tide goes out, you get to see the naked people. The idea being that when the water is in and everybody's swimming and having a great time, all kinds of things can be going on, and you don't know who's at risk and who's failing and who isn't. But as soon as the tide leaves, you get to see where the real weaknesses are and what's not working. Right. And the tide is way out now, and those places that are strong and can jump in and do the work that has to be done, they've had a bathing suit on the whole time. and they're
What
likely to
metaphor.
be successful.
I don't know how you top that metaphor, Joe. Do you want to?
Well, it's summertime.
Actually, that's a great outro for our session today. So those
All
are
right.
a good story.
That's great. That's great. Thank you.
All right.
Well, I don't know that we've resolved in our office hours all of the complexities related to leading organizations, our communities, or ourselves. But nonetheless, I think we've demonstrated that leadership must continue to be studied. We must continue to work on our definitions and shared understanding. And hopefully we'll figure something out soon.
Right.
Well, I really thank you, and I really enjoyed our conversation. And thank you, Larry. Thank you, Scott, for joining us on the latest episode of Office Hours. To see the replay, to contact any of us, or to get more information, feel free to go to our website, which the link is below, or to see any other episodes as well. Thank you for attending today. And remember, you can't drive a car looking in the rearview mirror, and the professors now have to go back to class. Have a good day. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.